I'd like to preface this conversation after the fact. While I was editing, it occurred to me that it might not be clear that many of the positions that I am articulating are not my own. I raised challenges against nationalism as an ideology, and Joel is responding to those challenges, and I'm throwing some other challenges at him. Not all of them are positions I hold myself, and that might not always be clear. So I just wanted to say that up front to avoid confusion. I also noticed that Joel has a problem interrupting, and he should probably correct that.
All right, we're good. So what do you have in mind?
Yeah, so I was watching your Questions for Nationalists video, and I thought you raised some interesting points, and I kind of view part of what I do as trying to create a more sophisticated version of nationalist ideology to help this kind of disparate nationalist community, dissident right community, whatever you want to call it, which has kind of popped up on the internet and exists as this kind of specter of negation, basically, of the globo homo consensus, if you will, which obviously took a particular form in the English-speaking world, with the alt-right and the rise of Trump and all the fallout from that. But what I notice is that, I think you would agree with this, you were kind of making the point in your video, which is that there isn't exactly a lot of ideological unity in the scene, right? There are all these different kind of subgenres of the worldview. There's this basic idea that, okay, well, white people are being kind of demographic intentionally, and there is this kind of anti-agenda. And this is bad. Everyone agrees upon this, but exactly how to respond to it is not self-evident, because in order to respond to it, you can't just respond to it in the sense of saying, I don't like this and negating it, but you have to actually propose an alternative political arrangement, which requires political philosophy, social theory, and so on. And so a very sophisticated response is required that just generally isn't there. So I'm trying to work through these problems to try and help out with this.
There isn't really ideological unity. I would really just take any candidate ideology. For me, political theory always entails ethical propositions. And when I look at any given nationalist position, I'm just not seeing the normative content, prescriptive content. It usually does boil down to emoting negative sentiments about what's happening, or emoting a positive sentiment of ethnocentrism and a desire for the well-being of your people. But you really need more than that to be an ideology, I think. And you need ideology in the modern day to compete in public discourse.
Yeah, so there's a few kind of problems that you raised. One of them was just like the term nationalism is problematic. I think that's kind of the thesis, I guess. My defense is basically that no, nationalism is not a dirty word that's lost, but actually signifies something important and maintains gravitas in the minds of many for good reason. But rather than discussing that, because we have to discuss everything else, there's a kind of few other elements to what you were discussing. So I guess like the logical place to start is probably not in the order in which you presented it in the video, but you kind of talk about particularism and universalism. And this is a debate that I have a lot because, obviously I'm a Christian, and then I encounter a lot of so-called like neo-pagan types that are in these communities, and they tell me that my religion is anti because it's universalist. You think you can go to heaven, therefore you're going to betray the white race or something. And you can only really truly be pro-white if you reject Judeo-Christianity or whatever and become some kind of neo-pagan who thinks that basically morality doesn't exist in regards to people outside of our race, which is a reprehensible position. It's a disgusting position, obviously, but that is an extreme variant in the scene that you get with people online. I don't know how many of them are sincere actors, how many of them are feds. It's probably a combination of the two, a mixture of just people who spend too much time on the internet who have mental illness. Yeah, like literal fed involvement in the scene. We know this already. There's plenty of evidence that there are many powerful organizations within the state and outside the state that have invested lots of money and have so many people working on so-called right-wing extremism and kind of monitoring and participating in and subverting its social media presence. But yeah, I am a moral realist and therefore a moral universalist. So that is not the direction that I want to go in. But you raised the point where you were talking about Keith's video and Azar Gat, and you were saying how, well, what Azar Gat is describing is just that well, in history, there are particular nations and they have political self-interest, which they recognize. And then they go, well, we need to have solidarity. We need to kind of organize in this political self-interest. Well, that's not really a ethical claim. That's just people acting collectively in self-interest. So what, right? This particular nation and its particular history acts in solidarity. So what? How do you extend this to a kind of universal claim? And therefore, you have to make a series of arguments. Number one, you have to make the argument of why ethnogenetic processes are kind of integral to human life. That it's not as though we have the kind of option of choosing to care about ethnicity or not caring about ethnicity. My contention would be that ethnicity is a kind of fact of human existence, which is just the product of communities of people who interbreed and create like a shared culture and a shared mentality, and that this is an organic process that is just natural to civilized human behavior and social formation. And then this carries over when you engage in political philosophy and you say, well, where does the state's legitimacy come from? I consider myself to be broadly within like the Aristotelian tradition of political philosophy. So I say, well, the state exists for the common good of a people, which it governs. And so that gives you a few things that you need to do. You need to define, well, who are the people? And secondarily, how do we know that the state is acting in its common interest? And I think these are the questions that ethno-nationalists are trying to answer. Then you kind of brought up in the video as well, this sounds kind of liberal, this idea of having this universal self-determination of different groups, and there's kind of like a democratic notion kind of bound up within popular sovereignty, although popular sovereignty is not necessarily democratic. It's still kind of in that ballpark, as if that's a problem or something. And it's like, well, I don't think it's necessarily a problem, because my criticism of liberalism is not necessarily this aspect of having a kind of universalistic moral framework, or that the government should be in the common interest or anything like this. These things seem quite straightforward and obvious notions. I don't think they can really be argued against very easily. The problems that I see with liberalism are more just kind of technical and procedural, in the sense of, well, if we have this kind of pluralism of individual interests, then we have all these minoritarian factions that end up kind of fighting within this liberal constitutional framework for power. And this fundamentally undercuts this project of pursuing the common good, because it encourages pluralism rather than unity. And so my bias would be towards, well, how do we facilitate unity so that we can have a government in the interest of the common good, rather than diversity and pluralism, in which government becomes basically a battle for power between different interest groups and different factions, which over time annihilates any kind of common identity that can really be shared. It purges it of all content. This would be the criticism of multiculturalism and diversity, is that like by kind of encouraging these views, you're basically saying that there is no culture and there is no basis for political community having a kind of common understanding of itself. There is no people then. There are just peoples and there are disparate groups. And so you're kind of annihilating any kind of organic basis for state legitimacy, because you're not deriving it from any kind of organic process by which our people as a distinct, unique group that recognizes itself can actually form and give to a state a kind of sense of what the common good could be in the first place. So, yeah, I think that's kind of the direction I think that nationalist ideology has to go in, as opposed to this just basic idea of, well, white people are tired of all these double standards, although I think that's also a good basic ethical argument that, well, how come there are these double standards for all these other groups except us? But it has to kind of rise beyond that and beyond racism, basically, to a kind of a question of the kind of organic nature of human communities, the ethnic form that they take, and where does the state get its legitimacy from?
Right. So I agree that nations are organic things. They will spontaneously emerge, even if you mixed everyone together now. Geography and just kind of cultural facts would lead to the development of this type of group, you know, larger than a tribe, larger than a clan. It's an inevitable thing to some extent, but technology does change the way that that organic type will emerge in the future. And there always has been dynamism regarding formation of nations, like ethnocentrism moves in waves led by historical events. And we're in the middle of the largest period of migration in Earth's history. So you can't rely on this is an inevitable thing. This is an organic structure, and therefore we have to kind of find a proper place for it. So I'm going to tie that point into a conception of American identity around capitalism and equality of opportunity, meritocracy, this sort of thing. A lot of people embrace the American identity because it is this place where you can rise from your own effort by your own bootstraps. And we treat immigrants, we treat people who aren't part of our historical ethnic stock very well, and they end up treating us well. I'm not endorsing this position myself. I'm just saying this is a position on the American national identity in this age of rapid ethnogenesis and national transformation. Someone like Elon Musk was an American, and yet he has one of the most successful companies in America. There are many such cases, right? So you need some way of tying down the self-interest of the nation as a group, even in the context where someone can move to another land when they see greater opportunity for themselves. I think that's kind of the normative framework that people our age in general operate within. Like, it is legitimate to abandon your family ties, to abandon the local community of your origins. And in a certain way, I think many parents would see you doing something wrong if you forewent, is that a word? Opportunities in some foreign place. So I think the national tie, it's there. It is an inevitable kind of gravity that creates polities of a sort at a certain scale, and that has to be considered, but also the technological landscape, ease of travel, etc., has to be considered. So what do you say to someone who embraces that capitalist view of American identity? This is a land of freedom. This is a land where anyone can accomplish anything they set their mind to, regardless of their origins. A lot of people find inspiration in that. So the nationalists would have to be able to say that that kind of proposition nation is wrong in some sense. Like, the Catholic definition of a nation obviously used to be people of shared ancestry, but that's no longer the Catholic definition. The Catholic definition is something like people living in a contiguous region governed by the same civil authority. Or it's basically a kind of proposition nation nationalist definition that the church has arrived at. How do you argue for a privileging of already existing ethnic types? Because if it's open for like unbounded ethnogenesis and mixing, I don't see how you formulate that.
If we're going to go by the church, there is plenty of examples, very contemporary examples. A very pertinent one would be Pope John Paul II's speech to the UN in 1995, where he endorses strongly the definition of the nation as a people of shared ancestry, raising the Latin etymology and defending the notion of ethnic self-determination. And this is like past the end of history. Francis Fukuyama, Bill Clinton as president and so on, and the Pope is defending this explicitly. So this idea that Catholicism has completely rejected ethno-nationalism, I don't think is true.
Well, I mean, if you attend Mass and listen to the prayers and petitions, you will.
No, but I think it's more indicative. Well, I think it's more indicative of the fact that politically the definition has shifted in general parlance and in general kind of political normativity. And so that influences the church, but I don't think the influence is like formally decided in any kind of absolute way in the church's like social and political teaching. I'm not going to say that like Catholicism necessitates that you have to be an ethno-nationalist or something. I don't think that's a defensible view, but I also don't think it's a defensible view to say that Catholicism prohibits ethno-nationalism either. I think you can make the case.
This historical institution that a lot of ethno-nationalists have attached themselves to, it is susceptible to the same shifting definition of the nation.
But I mean, I'm a traditional Catholic, so for example, in Mass today, the priest was ranting about, the heresies of modernism and how they've undermined the church for hundreds of years, as Pope Pius X prophesied back in the 19th century and so on. So generally speaking, people in like radical right communities are going to be traditionalist Catholics who are critical of many of the kind of modernist degeneration of the church, the outwardly earthly facing church and the institution in the kind of human sense of the term. So I think when it comes to its political teachings, like in the informal sense, I kind of view a lot of the church as basically cucked, to use a kind of vernacular phrase. Like, so I don't really kind of take heed from that. Instead, I look more deeply into the tradition of the faith and try to kind of honor that, as opposed to
that I'm raising, this institution with thousands of years of social teachings and precedents, even it has shifted its definitions in recent years. So how do
Well,
you have a definition, a normative claim about the naturalness and rightness of national
yeah,
identity?
I can get to the national identity question. I was just specifically speaking to when you raised
Yeah.
Catholicism. I think a good example of this idea that I don't think Catholicism has decided against ethno-nationalism is the fact if you look in Europe today, the only white nations that are really kind of maintaining ethno-national integrity there's a few Orthodox nations, but a lot of them are Catholic. Croatians, the Poles, the Hungarians. So this idea that like Catholicism is incompatible with ethno-nationalism, I reject. I mean, we see historically as well, it's obviously been very integral in like Irish nationalism and so on.
Yeah, I'm not rejecting that.
Mm.
Just to be clear, I'm saying even the church is susceptible to these kinds of shifting definitions. So, how do you respond to proposition nation nationalism if the justification is for the normative status of national identity and national
Mm.
sovereignty, perhaps as well? If the claim is that it's inevitable, this is a natural structure, and we have to fit it into our political landscape in the right way, if that's the
Yeah,
reasoning that
so
technology changes that organic condition and
yeah,
ethnogenesis, new formations are possible now. It's not necessarily inevitable that you just belong to an ethnic type. It's still a force, but it has changed in the modern day in some way.
yeah, so there's like a few elements to this. The first element to deal with is ethnogenesis. Now, obviously, as an Australian, I think, and you could probably relate as an American, my view on ethnogenesis, I think, is quite relevant because Australia is quite a young nation. But nevertheless, I do consider Australians to be a distinct ethnic group from, I mean, I spent some time in Britain earlier this year, a few months. And even though pretty much all my ancestry is Anglo-Saxon with like a little Irish and continental European sprinkled in, but it's predominantly Anglo-Saxon. And I did feel comfortable in Britain, but didn't feel like home. And the people felt a certain kind of distance from them that I don't feel from Australians. And I've had an experience of missing home that I'd never quite felt in my life before. And I was very happy to return and to be around people who share my sensibilities and my mentality again. It actually made me appreciate my ethnic identity more than previously because I
Let
didn't
me
realize that I would feel like that.
On
I
the other
do.
side of that, so I grew up in Southern California, which is
Mm,
one of the most racially heterogeneous places in the country. And I made friends with a lot of East Asians, Filipinos, and when they went back to visit their homeland, experienced the same sort of alienation that you describe to some extent in Great Britain. So it seems like being in America and like being raised around people with certain norms for at least some people carries greater weight than shared ancestry.
yeah, of course, right? And I guess that's my point is that I believe when it comes to the state, because as you say, technology has changed. We're in this kind of technocratic managerial age, and the state is now more able to kind of assert itself through social engineering upon the constitution of its population. 20th century really brought that into prominence unlike ever before in human history. Basically, what I'm saying as an ethno-nationalist is you got to be careful how you use this technology because you can really do deep damage to the unity of your nation. Conversely, you can also use this to repair the unity of your nation. So, for example, China is about 90 to 92% Han Chinese, but they do have some ethnic minorities, which are quite significant in number because of the sheer, 90% sounds like a lot, but it's 1.3, 1.4 billion people, right? So their minorities are like bigger than most nations. You've got the Uyghurs and the Manchus, and the Chinese state. It doesn't want to have Han identity, Uyghur identity, and Manchu identity going on forever. What it wants to have is Chinese identity. So it's promoting interbreeding, like through social engineering, particularly with the Uyghurs, and trying to kind of disabuse the Uyghurs of their Islamic faith, and so on, and trying to create this idea of the Chinese race explicitly. It's a
Yeah.
cornerstone of Xi Jinping thought. So that's an example of, basically conscious ethnogenesis as a state policy. And I think that is going to be only going to make them a stronger nation, right? Because what they fear is separatism. These groups are going to feel alienated because they're minorities, and then maybe foreign powers can kind of press upon that, and that's a threat to the Chinese state. The Chinese state obviously is kind of responding to what it saw with the breakdown of the Soviet Union, where the Soviet Union fractured into all these nation states, and it kind of used that as a lesson that you can't just allow this ethnic plurality to kind of continue. As soon as times get tough, the state fractures upon those ethnic lines. The Yugoslavs are another example. So my view is that, well, some people that are like hardcore white nationalists might dislike that, but it's like, okay, well, if we don't have shared ancestry now, well, then I think it's complicated. There's only a certain amount you can do with interbreeding, but ultimately, I think the goal for a nation wants to kind of maintain its unity should be to promote, if it has these like disparate ethnic groups within itself, is to kind of promote a certain degree of mixing between them. But
powers that be in America are totally nationalist because certainly.
But that's not true because of the sheer amount of immigration that they're bringing in, and also if you have, it's very difficult to mix them together properly. We've seen examples of this, like in places like Brazil, where what you get is this kind of de facto caste system because the genetic admixture is so diverse. So in China, if you're trying to mix Uyghurs with Han, okay, there's a lot more genetic similarity there. So you can kind of envisage those boundaries getting blurry in a far more kind of routine sense. Whereas if you're trying to mix with white, it's a whole different kettle of fish. And generally, if you want to absorb something into a genome, you want to have a kind of racial stock that is a majority of one type and absorb just like the outliers into it. So again, in China, you've got like 92% Han, you can absorb these outliers on the fringe, and everyone's going to become basically spicy Han, right? So what I would say about, like, for example, in Australia, it's like, okay, we've got like 75%, but a lot of the people who are non-whites are dual citizens with foreign states. So I would say, well, look, you literally are a citizen of another state. You don't need to be a citizen of our state. You need to pick a team. I think a lot of those people would pick the team of wherever they came from. That would whittle that number down quite a lot. And the ones who remain, you could say, well, look, we're going to promote a kind of Australian ethnogenesis. You don't get to have your little ethnic enclaves. You don't get to maintain your separate culture. If you want your separate culture, we'll help you return to the nation where you can have that culture, where you belong. But if you want to be here, you've got to assimilate. Again, I think a lot of people would choose to leave. And the ones who really want to stay, you can say, okay, well, we're humanitarians. Let's try and integrate you. And then over the generations, it's a gradual process. That assimilation will occur naturally in time. And I think we can live with that. We will actually develop, we'll move towards unity from diversity, move towards a kind of a coherent culture from multiculturalism. So these would be the kinds of policies that I would advocate for, to say, well, if we want to have a real democracy, we want to have government in the common interest and the common good of a people, we need to have our people. So we need to have policies that move towards unity, not diversity, that move towards culture from non-culture, which is multiculturalism and so on. And that move towards shared ancestry from disparate ancestry, and move towards shared loyalty from antagonism and divided loyalties and so on. So it's a kind of directional thing, I think.
There's two classificationary frameworks that you're throwing out. One is real political, that like China will be stronger if China is one people, right? The other is that national unity is a precondition of popular sovereignty. That's an assertion that the nation state is a natural and necessary mode of government, but there are multi-ethnic empires where the civil authorities don't coincide with discrete ethnic types.
Yeah, there are. And I'm saying my criticism of them is I don't believe in these spaces, unless you were to have a very high degree of ethnic self-determination allowed within them and some kind of alliance between disparate ethnic leaders. Like, for example, in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, there wasn't this sense of Austria and Hungary are now the same nation. There was this understanding. These are the Austrian people, these are the Hungarian people, and they have a political unity, but they still have distinct nations. I think arrangements like that can work. But this idea of completely annihilating their difference and their autonomy altogether and just kind of crashing them into like one state form and just moving them all into the exact same place. And you have like the cities where like you go from town to town and they're different ethnic enclaves of different groups and you keep mass immigrating more people from other places. This is something very different than what you're describing, right? Than like, say, for example, the Russians, where you've got in Chechnya, there's the Chechens, but then you go over here and, you know, the Caucasians or whatever, you got these like different groups in different kind of regions that are kind of semi-autonomous within the empire. It's a different arrangement. I'm not endorsing exactly how the Russians organize things. They have problems with immigration as well, but surely you can understand that these two things aren't the same. What's happening in the United States and other Western European countries and Australia is not the same thing as these arrangements.
Austria-Hungary is not the same as what's happening in America. Sure. But what I want to see is like a normative justification, leave the real politics aside, because whether or not homogenous nations are helpful on the world stage today depends on whose interests you are considering. So you kind of presupposing that the national interest is a real thing, and I don't think we've gotten that far. I don't think we've established that.
So we've got to go back to political philosophy then. We've got to kind of build up from the ground before we could even talk about nations, I think. So you could go back to basic like Aristotle's politics and just say, well, if we have a teleological view, which I don't believe you can have ethics without teleology, I would assume you'd probably agree with that.
Yes.
Yeah, so, you know, man, to achieve his end, obviously needs to be within a community, or he needs to be within a family, and families need to be within communities, and man needs to participate in communities. And for communities to achieve their ends, they need political leadership, right? They need to have laws and so on, common defense. So this would be my criticism of like libertarianism in the essence. I would say, no, I side with classical philosophy. You can't isolate the individual from his embedment within the family, the community, and the political community. This kind of arbitrary isolation of man's interest in a context which doesn't really exist because man isn't an island. I think that's...
But listen, okay. On that point, what libertarianism does is it does not enforce the perpetuation of these ethnic types of particular kinds of local communities. It does, though, allow for them. And if they are natural structures, people will naturally congregate in that way. And since most people don't move that far from home, the rates are a lot higher now than they were like 50 years ago, obviously. But there is still a kind of priority of where you were born. You kind of stick to that region. Under a libertarian order, ethnic enclaves will certainly form, cultures will gravitate around national identities, and I just don't see...
Okay, so what I'm saying, though, is that there is no... Because of this recognition that man's end is achieved in the political community, there is no libertarianism. It's a fantasy, in my view. And libertarianism, there's lots of technical reasons why it can't work because of all the benefits that accrue from the centralization of bureaucratic administration and the kind of exponential gains you can get in technological development and so on that basically create a elite managerial strata of social engineers. And so when we're talking about the kind of organic basis of the nation, we are talking about something that we can observe in history and something which is being corrupted by the enhanced capacity of these centralized states and their artificial capacity to socially engineer. And so my objection to what is happening is that now we live in a world in which nature is being interrupted, where nations were just forming organically since forever in the history of civilization. Now, with enhanced social engineering, they can be destroyed, as we're seeing, right? The great advancement is happening. And so that means we need to take a more purposive view. We can't just allow things to occur naturally because there is this artificial mechanism that exists that can literally intervene upon that natural process. And so just like you could say, well, there are many plants that agriculture grows, which can occur naturally without an agricultural process bringing them to fruition. Well, once you kind of level the forest where vegetation would grow naturally, now the forest has been leveled and it's been turned into a farm. And so now the question is, what are we going to grow? And you can never just go back to the natural state that existed. We live on the farm now. And so now we have to take into consideration the agency of the farmer. And when it comes to libertarianism, this idea of, well, just let people naturally do kind of markets and everything. Let's just get like the state out of the way and just let people organize. The thing is that people naturally organize into states. They naturally organized into these managerial, bureaucratic, administrative structures. That's literally what's happened in history because they accrue all of these benefits. People like having access to what the state can provide in terms of national security, in terms of all the kind of services that the state administers. In the United States, I believe last year, the US national budget was something like $7 trillion or something, because we had this disease. We wanted the state to intervene, engage in this kind of radical project during COVID of locking everything down and so on. And then it had to like artificially maintain the economy and give people this money and prop up all these businesses and so on. When a massive crisis occurs, people turn to the state to solve it. That's the reality of the world we live in. We're not going back to libertarianism. Like the Libertarian Party in the United States gets like 2% of the vote. No one is a libertarian except a small, very small group of people that are never going to achieve very much institutional influence. Basically, the only real institutional influence libertarians have in the United States, which is probably where the strongest libertarian tradition is in the world, is the Koch brothers funding the Cato Institute to kind of lower taxes on big corporations or something. It's really not relevant politically in any meaningful way.
Again, here you're kind of blending together the moral justification with a real political assertion. And I don't necessarily agree with that calculus, because I think a lot of the wealthiest people do lean libertarian, and also the wealthiest people get their policies enacted. And so maybe you're not going to get pure libertarian, but libertarian ideological principles have and will continue to shape US domestic policy, tax policy, as you say. So it's not irrelevant, certainly not irrelevant, especially when the tech sector leans very heavily libertarian in some regards. Also, don't think we should engage in a kind of reification fallacy regarding libertarianism itself. Obviously, that exists on a spectrum. But the core question I'm kind of getting at, leaving the real politics aside, is this like actionable or not? In the abstract, ideologically, what's the problem with allowing people to associate how they like, presuming that you have like a monopoly on force that allows a kind of voluntarist multiculturalism to exist? What is the problem with allowing people to move where they like? I mean, in the current day, this is prohibited asymmetrically against certain ethnic types because of restrictions on discrimination in the workplace, discrimination in housing. You know, there are a lot of laws that effectively render voluntary association unfeasible for ethnic groups. So we could correct for that by leaning into libertarianism in the US, especially when it has this traction. But then I'm bringing in the real politics there as well. But what I'm getting at is like, what is the moral problem once we have a monopoly of force at the national level that's enforcing this libertarian legal framework? Why can't you just let people associate as they want? Why and how do we give ethnic types a limited or unlimited form of sovereignty? How do you administer that? And we've talked before about the long run consequences also of having like unfettered, fully sovereign states of whatever composition around the world. So anyway, that point on libertarianism, why is it wrong to just allow people, assuming you have the legal apparatus to do it, why can't you just allow people to associate as they desire? And then where's the extra step to like legitimate and authorize any ethnic separatist group that wants its own state? That doesn't seem feasible.
So there's a lot there. So we should break it into sections. Now, we kind of also deviated from really getting into the weeds with political philosophy on questions of what is legitimacy and so on. I'll deal with libertarianism because it's a subject that's kind of come up, and then I'll move into political philosophy and we'll bracket some of those other questions until we finish with this subject. So when it comes to libertarianism, you say, what's wrong with like removing laws that prevent you from racially discriminating and so on? Yeah, I would support that. I would side with the libertarians to do that. That would be a positive development, particularly in the American context. So sure, from a pragmatic level, but from a deeper level, when you get to the kind of political philosophy underlining state legitimacy, like I said, what is the end of the state? You know, what is the natural end of the state? The state, from this classical Aristotelian kind of model, the state exists for the community, and the community exists for the good of the families and the individuals which make it up. So therefore, we have to kind of justify the state, not upon its own terms, if the state exists to enrich itself, but the state exists for the community that it governs, for its good. A lot of scholastic political philosophy held this idea. It's Aristotelian. You know, this is kind of coming up again and again throughout the Western tradition. I believe there's a strong political Aristotelianism. You could even argue people like Rousseau and Hegel and so on are kind of maybe degenerated versions of this tradition.
But then how do you define the good of the nation and the good in general? Because depending on how you define the good, you might end up supporting different kinds of national constitutions. Like if you're a hedonist utilitarian, maybe you have a different solution than if you're a Platonist, right? So
Yeah, well, obviously I'm not a hedonist utilitarian, so if you want to talk about like moral realism, my view on ethics, I kind of bias towards like a combination of deontological ethics and virtue ethics. I think you need to
okay, then
have a certain element of the
how
I
does a
think you need
group have a
well, I think the deontological arguments are important, particularly when you're trying to kind of come up with a legal system, because you have to come up with, okay, so how can we create universalizable norms that can basically apply to create the end of peace in the community and other kind of obvious ends, security, prosperity, and so on. You have these obvious common goods, and then you then kind of engage in kind of rational dialectic to identify universalizable principles that would necessarily be kind of contingent. But then also, like, that's also kind of limited to existing within a legalistic frame. So you want to incorporate more into your ethical philosophy than just that. You also want to have a kind of existential quality. You want to say, okay, so how can I live virtuous life? How can I live the good life? Basically, well, when I think about the I that is living the good life, that turns out to be a complicated problem, because identity is not just Joel, and I don't just identify just with my habits and desires, but my identity is bound up within all these other relations, my familial relations, my ethnic relations, my relations to my friends, my relations to larger projects, to God, and so on. And so this very complex notion of identity gives me a kind of a basis upon which I have these kind of relations of duties and obligations to others. Ultimately, the highest obligation is to God, obviously, and there are certain commandments that I'm subject to as a result of this, but also I have obligations primarily to my family and so on that are kind of natural, or like really close friends. Like if I have a really good friend that I've known since high school and we hang out all the time and he calls me up like, oh, I'm moving house, can you help me move house? Well, I would be a shit friend if I didn't say yes, unless I had a really good reason to get out of it. But if I just meet a guy like last week for the first time and he calls me up and asks me to help him move house, I don't really feel any obligation to this guy, right? So I think the best way to understand the good life is to kind of think about this expanded notion of identity and this kind of nexus of duties and so forth that this implies.
Okay.
Well, and so that's kind of where my nationalism comes from, is saying, well, I have duties to my people and their common interests. Ultimately, I have a kind of spirit of service to kind of protect this group, because Australianism is kind of this non-negotiable quality of myself. Like I never chose to be Australian. I just am. And I could never choose not to be. I just am. How I talk, how I think, my attitude towards the world, it just is. And actually, as I've kind of developed in my political thinking, for example, and then learned about the Australian tradition, I realized that I independently reproduced what the Australian tradition actually itself produced in a lot of political philosophy, for example. And so I end up just kind of like cycling back to who I already am in the first place. And one example that I used is like when I was like a kid watching the Olympics, like I just wanted the Australian guy to win the gold medal. No one had to tell me you should want this guy to win or something. It was just kind of self-evident, this kind of sense of identity, right? That was just bound up in this. So that's important. That implies duties. My duty isn't just to myself to kind of pursue fleeting pleasures that make me feel good, right? Because my concept of identity isn't isolated just to that. I don't just identify with my body and its passions.
Sure, you don't. I think you're going to need something more specific than generic nationalism to make these sorts of claims, because nationalism is not like the deepest part of your own philosophy. Presumably Catholicism is the deepest part of it. And so it's going to be hard to make space for a general nationalist justification of the state, because the definition of the common good may be very different for different underlying philosophical systems. You might have like Ayn Randian individualist deeper presuppositions, and like they could voluntarily decide in their paradigm to form a national identity of sorts. Or you could have someone who's, there's different underlying value systems, different ethical definitions. So you're like stating yours in some sense, and you're saying why you believe in the idea of duty and all of that. But
so Thomas Aquinas said that patriotism is a form of piety. The commandment to honor one's father and mother can be extrapolated into patriotism, because a nation is a people of shared ancestry. My ancestry in Australia goes back to its inception.
Thomas Aquinas also agreed with Aristotle that some people are by nature fit to perform physical work, and peoples, not just individuals, are fit to perform like intellectual foresight, and therefore, like just like Aristotle said, Hellenes should rule over barbarians, and barbarians should be the slaves of the Hellenes. Thomas Aquinas kind of implicitly supports that too. So let's put it this way. If the good of the nation is getting as many people into heaven as possible, what if a slave state gets more people into heaven? Like in the US, under slavery, more blacks were Christians than they are today. Does that justify slavery in the US? It would seem to, if you really care about the salvation of souls, right? So I think,
well, yeah, I mean, if that was true, if slavery was ultimately for the good of the slaves, then how could you argue against it? Like, you would be arguing against the good of the slaves if you
right,
were saying
but that moral argument would be compelling to another Christian, right? But if you talk to someone who's not a Christian, who has different ethical beliefs, then someone else might say that's not right because it denies the kind of natural group interests of the slave caste. You need a specific foundation for your moral framework to have a coherent ideology here. Like nationalism just seems incapable of being a free-floating ideology. So when you say politically, I'm a nationalist, I just think inherently it has a kind of incoherence to it because it can't ground those ethical claims. It can't claim of the common.
Nationalism isn't an ethic; it's a political ideology. So the ethics are behind it, right? They're not.
Right.
Nationalism isn't itself an ethical theory, right? Like, we have to use other ethical theories to kind of substantiate it.
It implies ethical theories.
Well, no, it's built out of ethical theories. It is a product of ethical theories because ethics comes prior to politics. You said that at the beginning, right?
Yeah, well, the posterior implies the prior, right? So, yeah, I mean, that means then that without a particular ethical framework, nationalism can't work because it doesn't supply its own ethical norms. So you need something broader.
That's true. Yeah, that's true about any political ideology.
Necessarily say any, because you could have like John Stuart Mill, his kind of utilitarianist liberal philosophy. He kind of works in a humanist ethical framework with a humanist liberal political framework, and it's all together as part of one system. I think you can have systems that are all together in that way. I'm against the existence of compartmentalized ideology. I think we always
it's not really compartmentalized. I mean, I see like communitarianism as a pretty standard interpretation of like Catholic social and political teaching, agrees with my basic ethics, and I just view like communitarianism as not being intelligible outside of notions of ethnogenesis. Like, how can you really conceive of human political communities independently of ethnogenesis? I don't think that's really possible to do so, because even if you have a political community, even if it is ethnically diverse, if it is like isolated as a political community over sufficient time, it'll tend towards ethnogenesis like over time as like a natural consequence. You have to kind of actively attack this tendency, like, which is basically the policies of contemporary Western governments, is to actively sabotage their own natural tendencies toward ethnogenesis and decry them as immoral because they'll lead to a Holocaust or something. Because
I don't think you have to actively intervene. Migration habits throughout history have always been the same.
But migration isn't just allowed to happen. There are such things as national borders, right? So, like, for example, I know in the United States you have a porous border, but for example in Australia, no one's coming here basically that isn't allowed in by the government. So we can decide how many people can come here, and also if they come here, that's one thing. Being in your country doesn't mean they have citizenship, right? Citizenship has to be kind of given if anyone's going to get it in a formal sense. So there is agency over this process. It's not just like people are just moving around and there's nothing we can do about it. That's just not true, right? Particularly from an Australian perspective, living on an island.
True. In the absence of state intervention, people do move from less wealthy areas to more wealthy areas. That's always been the case.
Yeah, but what I'm arguing for, I'm a statist. I believe, okay, well, if we're going to have political communities, they require government. And that government needs to be in the common good of that community. So in Australia, if we say, well, it's in our interest not to have immigrants coming in, we just want Australians in Australia, and we agree. And if you poll Australians consistently, they always say they want less immigration all the time, like the whole history of the country, notoriously, in fact. So it seems like that's the general perception. And there's a lot of good arguments. Like, for example, during COVID, we didn't have really any real immigration because all the borders were shut down. And like there's literally like mass employment. Everyone's got jobs because we don't have a bunch of immigrants pouring in. And it's a time of prosperity, even though it's supposed to be a time of crisis. And everything's fine. It's not like we're like, oh no, where's all the immigrants? Like we're all, where's all the new Uber drivers? Where's all the, you know what I mean? Like where's all the new 7-Eleven clerks? Like no one's freaking out because we don't actually need them. We've got our own people here that are capable of running our own society, and it's great. So
Okay.
So,
Even
so
if
why, if we decide, if we're here and we have our country and we're all operating together in the interests of our collective self-interest, why do we need to just, people in poor countries want to live here because they want access to our resources? Why do we have to let them live here? We have no obligation to do this. And Australians are quite generous. We're happy to kind of provide money to charities and foreign aid and so forth to help other poorer nations and so on. But why do they have to come and live in our country and undermine our way of life and dilute our national character? I mean, why should we have to surrender that? Don't we have why can't we have our own country and which is based upon our identity and our way of life?
Okay. So we've kind of gone back into like anecdotal thinking, and we've gotten away from the main kind of justification of a particular concept of a common good and a particular concept of a national identity. So migration naturally does happen. I mean, if you look at the surface of the earth, about half of the landmass is occupied by European peoples. European peoples are about, 10% of the global population. So that asymmetry in wealth and land, in the absence of like defending these territories from immigration actively, would simply happen. So that would be the gravity of things. That would be the tendency of things. Now, what you need then is a definition of a people, a nation that is grounded from first principles. You could do that through Catholicism, but Catholicism has shown itself incapable of defending that position in the light of like postmodernity. They have not stood behind that. Some isolated Catholic thinkers have, but the church is a pro-globalization institution. And the good of the nation for Catholics is tied into like whatever leads to global peace. The Catholics also care about. In Aristotle's politics, like the village is subordinate to the nation because the nation is the greater whole of which the village is the part. So the interests of the village are subordinate in some sense to the interest of the nation. An identical kind of reasoning can be applied to the global situation, and Catholics, no surprise, following Aristotelian reasoning, have concluded that globalization does promote peace, prosperity, etc. And I don't think that that's actually arguable. Like economic globalization has increased production of consumer goods. Now, that means like GDP goes up. That does not necessarily mean that people are becoming happier or moving closer to salvation. But you get what I'm saying. Like,
well, I think there's a few elements to this. Like you said, number one, that white people occupy all this territory, but you have to take in consideration, presumably Canada, Russia, and Australia are doing a lot of the work there in that statement. And a lot of that territory is basically uninhabitable, right? Australia's got this massive desert in the middle. Russia, you get Siberia, and Canada, pretty much everyone lives within like something like 50 miles of the American border because everything upwards is freezing. So that's kind of like a bit fudgy, I think, that logic. But anyway, to get to what you're saying about world peace, yeah, obviously, as a Catholic, world peace is of paramount importance, right? Particularly in the age of nuclear weapons. But the contention that globalism is achieving world peace, maybe you could make that case more strongly in the 90s. But look at basically what globalism has been built upon. One element that has been built upon is Bush influence in the United States political system, which led to how many wars in the Middle East. Secondarily, you also have this war in Ukraine happening right now, which seems to not...
One, I might have to edit that out. Two, how does that follow from globalization? That, like, I think these are two separate historical facts.
No, because you're talking about this kind of process of like multiculturalism is good for world peace or something, because we're creating this kind of global community. But the United States obviously is the kind of like active agent in this process, right? The United States is the hegemon that kind of guarantees globalism. And the United States, previously to its intervention in the Second World War, more or less, was relatively isolationist power. It did have Monroe Doctrine to try and kick the European powers out of its general vicinity. But outside of that, if you look at public opinion polls, the American public didn't want anything to do with the First or Second World War. American public basically just wanted to stay out of running the world. And the American public, by doing things like electing Trump in 2016, is demonstrated time and time again that even when W. Bush ran, he ran on we need to have less foreign intervention, criticizing the Clinton administration for getting involved in Yugoslavia and so on, and then look at what happened. But generally speaking, popular sentiment in the United States is non-interventionist. And it is this kind of elite that have kind of always been pushing American intervention. So globalism is built upon massive amounts of US foreign intervention. And there's a series of wars that has occurred with Vietnam and Iraq being like two potent examples, but various other wars and aggression. All of these nuclear weapons pointed at these other powers. And on the peripheries of this empire, it's directed towards the Chinese, and you're seeing tensions increasing in Taiwan. Obviously, you have the Ukraine war with the Russians. You have who knows what the future is going to hold with the dynamic between the Iranians and the Saudis and the Israelis and so forth in the Middle East. This is hardly global stability, right? Along the fault lines of like the American-controlled kind of bloc, you have a powder keg, and on the other side, you have thousands and thousands of nuclear weapons pointed back in the other direction. So that's not an easy problem to solve. Like colonizing the other bloc, even winning the Cold War, didn't actually succeed. So I think globalism as a strategy for world peace, the ship has sailed upon that. We're already basically in the Second Cold War. So we have to kind of come up with a system for organizing the world in which there isn't going to be one global hegemon that is the unipole that just sets the tone for the entire world and can just flex its muscle upon everybody else to impose that world order. And so that means we have to negotiate a pluralistic world, right? We have to figure out how to negotiate between different interests, different nations. And I think Catholic just war theory, well, it's not just Catholic, but just war theory, which is like endorsed by the Catholic Church, mixed with a kind of universalist notion of self-determination. I think these elements are very useful in trying to work out how to have a pluralistic world, a world of nations. And I don't think globalism is good because basically people perceive globalism as a threat. They perceive the dissolution of their national sovereignty and the domination by this American-led world order and these kind of multinational corporations and like multilateral trade agreements and so forth. They view this with great suspicion, and rightly. That itself produces hostility and violence. It doesn't produce peace. So I don't think that that's the case. So I think this idea that in the interest of world peace, we have to kind of sign on to globalism, I don't buy this argument. I don't think it really stacks up with what we're seeing. And finally, when it comes to this kind of more general notion of we're living in a new technological space, my view is that legitimacy can either move in two directions. So as you said, like the political community is kind of more important than the elements that make it up in a certain sense because it is like a higher end. So the issue, therefore, that raises, though, is in a sense, yes, it is more important, but that doesn't give it the right to break apart the constitutive elements that bring it into being. So if you have a political community that's anti-family, that's anti-community, and that's basically what we have right now. We have like a state that is literally destroying the family structure, promoting contraception, abortion. It's promoting basically sexual liberation, feminism, divorce, all of these elements. And it's also importing a bunch of people to dilute the unity of the community in order to kind of basically bring in like supporters for the state's agenda, but basically to replace like kind of popular resistance that would kind of manifest from the previously relatively homogenous local population, that the state is kind of attacking its communitarian basis. The artificiality of the state as this kind of entity which is interested in enriching its own power, as opposed to kind of serving the common good, is this process. So I think the state is undermining its own principle of legitimacy with these processes, which is why I oppose them and say, well, the state should be doing the opposite. It should be supporting the family and it should be supporting the unity of the community, because from these things, political community can form which actually has legitimacy that traces itself back to the kind of natural end of the people who actually make it up. And what we see today, like in the United States, starkly, it's not actually a liberal democracy. The United States is clearly run by moneyed interests and this kind of elite managerial caste that have this kind of ideological agenda, and it's not run in the interests of the American people at all. So Like
Well,
that's why I say, well, this is the totally illegitimate arrangement, and why I don't see why should we support this system. I don't understand why we should support it when it doesn't seem to have any kind of basis in that kind of essential moral justification at all. Whereas if you go back 150 years, even 100 years, yeah, the United States had its problems. But I think you could still make a pretty good case that many elements of the US government were still actively working in the interests of the American people. And there was such a thing as an American people who knew who they were and had a certain sense of their collective interests. And there's just been this kind of whole process of attacking that and undermining that. My view is that we need a kind of restoration of these elements in order to kind of bring the state away from tyranny towards genuine moral leadership.
the most compelling argument that I've heard so far is that the state should preserve and protect the constituents that make it up at various scales, right? So individual, family, community, like that is a universal argument that I can follow that works. But it runs into the problem that that common good and preservation, it does not have to be a result of popular sentiment. Like the people in general can be totally wrong about what's in their interest.
I wasn't trying to imply that sentiment should be like that. Popular sentiment should decide whether the state policy is good or bad. That wasn't. If it came across like that, then that was just a mistake of how I presented it.
No. You just made a point that like Australians have always been against more immigration. Americans have been against increased immigration. But the point is, if we have occult technocracies that have access to information that we don't have, the people effectively making decisions on policy, if it is in their opinion, in the greater good of the nation, and maybe the greater good of the world, like we are a kind of global empire to some extent, still not as much as we used to be in the US. But if the whole is greater than the parts, yes, it has a duty to preserve aspects of that which composes itself. But if a greater end is in view of a minority with access to, classified information, then it's still very possible that they are acting.
It's not a greater end, though. It's a tyrannical end. Like, we know why that they are pursuing these immigration policies, and it's not to increase the size of the population, because why would they also be pursuing a series of policies which lower birth rates? They pursue, at the same time as they started opening the borders, they also started legalizing contraception, abortion, no-fault divorce, and so on, promoting sexual degeneracy. So they're not actually interested in increasing the population organically. They're interested in replacing the population. I've researched, the changes to immigration policy in the United States and Australia significantly, and what you have is minority ethnic groups lobbying for it, particularly one particular minority ethnic group, which is the kind of, which you might be thinking of, which maybe I can't say the name of because you want to post this on YouTube. And, in Australia, that minority ethnic group infiltrated our immigration bureaucracy. White Australia policy wasn't necessarily enshrined in law in a super explicit way, but it was done generally through kind of bureaucratic norms, because to kind of make it explicit in law would have been maybe kind of problematic in international diplomacy. They get infiltrated and all of a sudden they start importing like Vietnamese and so on in the 70s. But the agenda to push multiculturalism and to push the replacement of whites in their own countries, I just reject this idea that it was done because of these enlightened elites that just know so much better than us, like how to run countries. No, the policy has been terrible, for by so many metrics. And the justification is flimsy. It's clearly motivated because they want to attack the power base of the previously, homogenous white majorities in Western Europe, in places like Australia and the United States, like Western countries, because there are these certain interest groups that benefit from politically undermining people like you and me and our collective interests of people like you and me. That's what it's about. It's power politics. It's tyranny. It's not.
That's a historically contingent claim that may or may not be true. And I'm not a supporter of the regime. So I think actually what you're saying may well be true. But the principle is that if you have leadership with access to information that the public does not have access to, and that shows leadership that they ought to pursue some of these policies that seem to be detrimental to the ethnic stock or whatnot. Like, for example, the people who are pushing for globalization still today and the breaking up of local national identities, I think are thinking in terms of centuries down the line. If we have strong national identities, you might get another Hitler, you might get another dictatorial figure who's reckless, who gains a tyranny in his own land, has weapons of mass destruction, poses a threat to the world. Why they don't apply that same reasoning to China? Well, I suppose it makes sense because they can't beat China. So that's why China gets to have it and other countries don't. But, if that's like this reasoning from a globalist perspective, you don't have access to all the information that the ruling caste does. If it makes sense in their calculus, I mean, I don't know, they may be right that it is better for world peace in the end. That was the topic of our last discussion. And I think it's still kind of unresolved with increasing destructive potential of all sorts of technologies. If you allow independent actors full sovereignty and full ability to research whatever technologies they want, it seems like you're just setting up a powder keg for the planet.
Well, what I said in that, I don't remember exactly what I said in that debate, but I remember saying something along the lines of that I believe like international agreements already exist now, like doing this can mediate these things. So I think the international community can still organize where you still have independent nations where they can still set their own immigration policies and so on. I think these two things can coexist. And that they have to coexist because you're not actually going to achieve this kind of global homogenization where all the national identities are diluted. All that's being done is Western Europeans, North Americans, and Australians and New Zealanders. We're having our ethnic identities diluted, and no one else really is.
Identities, those are the ethnic identities that pose a legitimate threat that could technologically take off and become unpredictable and dangerous. So I think there's a reason why those kinds of nations in particular would be targeted if that's the grand strategy. So I don't know if I want to get back into that debate. Like, is some form of global political rule necessary? Is global surveillance necessary? I want to get back to this argument from like the preservation of the parts, because I think that has promise for some notion of state legitimacy that doesn't allow for this runaway technocratic foresight calculus justification, where if the ruling elite see that something is long run in the best interest of the planet, why shouldn't they just be allowed to follow that course? Because I think effectively that is what we're living under. Like, international bankers of various sorts have been directing policy all over the world and shaping history all over the world in accordance with a grand agenda that they have. Now, maybe that's kind of an inevitable process. People will vie for world domination. They will use all sorts of different technologies, financial technologies, social manipulation technologies to achieve that end. So how can you appeal to them that there is a necessity of this kind of preservation of the parts within the whole, and also a definition of the parts within the whole, such that ethno-nationalism is favored over civic nationalism or proposition nation nationalism? There are two separate issues here. If it was the case that some international elite group had access to way more information, like suppose that they were aliens, secretly the ruling elite are aliens, they know far more than us, and they are like subtly steering the course of human evolution to maintain its existence, and they allow as much freedom as they can, but like their hands are kind of tied. If it was a situation like that, then you're dealing with intelligent actors, and your political arguments can be heard and will influence their thinking to some degree. So that's like the benevolent elite hypothesis. I think Thomas Baden Rees has a hypothesis like that. Or you're dealing with a malevolent elite, in which case we can at least target by some criteria the nature of their malevolence and like unite people against them. But then you're kind of left with a vacuum. All right, if the global elite have been setting this global agenda, what happens when they're removed? It's like Saddam kept control over Iraq and then he was removed, and then what happened, right? So I think there is that kind of problem that you would end up dealing with. But I still don't think in the first place that we have good, really universal justifications for these particular subunits within the whole. The family seems very natural, but many communities have not had nuclear families. Many communities have been polygamous. I mean, there's a bunch of different family structures. Does one have exclusive normative force at the level of the nation? Do proposition nations have that legitimacy or not? If not, why? And then does any ethnic separatist group, regardless of how small it is, automatically deserve the support of the international community? These are the sorts of questions that are kind of tough to answer. I think without a kind of global elite force that has more foresight and more knowledge than the other peoples on the planet, we're not going to have an orchestrated and coherent response to technological threats, to like emerging tyrannies. So I know I threw out a bunch of different points just then, but simultaneously we need to address the properness of particular groups like the nuclear family, if that's legitimate, the ethno-state, if that's legitimate. What's the criteria when these need to be preserved? Also, what is their inherent good? What is their common good? What is the common good of the family? What is the common good of the nation? We've gone off on anecdotes and looked at different geopolitical things, but I feel like still I'm left with a very ambiguous picture about the legitimating framework of these different aspects of the hierarchy leading up to, like, the globe is the whole of all nations, isn't some kind of global end, therefore superior to any particular national end. And then if that's the case, how do you do that? Again, I think the key argument you gave is that the whole has to preserve its parts. That's really good. I think that could be used as a basis for some kind of coherent nationalist ideology that solves all these problems. But
Yeah. Okay, so first of all, this idea that the global elite they're just so enlightened and they have access to all this special information and we're just dumb and don't see what they're doing and why it's valuable. I reject this. I mean, I don't think they have access to particularly special information. I can kind of see the clear power political elements of the agenda. And so I view it as a tyranny. I don't view it as some like benevolent force. When it comes to the kind of part to whole relationship, and why I see that as important is because obviously when you talk about just like the national unit, it isn't just this arbitrary group of people. We're talking about a community, and a community needs to have like a shared intentionality. It needs to have a kind of shared identity. It needs to be needs to have a shared notion of the good, which it is kind of collectively working towards. So the organic basis for this comes from traditions and having normative structures of how you engage with one another. So like there is a kind of like essential moral basis that needs to exist within a community. Like, so for example, you know, in Australia, you can kind of get away with swearing more than you can in the United States. Like if I spoke to an Australian with kind of vulgarity, they wouldn't take offense. But if I go to America or Canada or something and speak the same way, they would take offense and so forth. There's all these kind of like subtle things, but it's not just superficial stuff like that. You can see like what's considered promiscuous in one culture is not considered a big deal in another culture and so forth. It can get actually quite important. Like, you know, I saw a video recently of England, I think London in 1901, and all the women that were walking on the street were dressed like Muslims, and like how we would understand Muslims to be dressed, in the sense that they had all their hair covered, they had extreme modesty, which is like crazy to think, like in comparison to today, like how people dress in London. It's like only the Muslims in London dress like that now. But moral norms that are directed towards the community's virtue and self-reproduction are directed towards the communal good. And actions, when you have norms that are kind of directed towards what benefits certain individuals or suits certain like private factions within that community, without consideration to like the communal good, we consider that to be bad. So like, for example, if we say, well, look, you know, people just want to be accepted, so we also have to be nice to them because it makes them feel good about their mental illness. You know, you could say this is maybe good for the person or something because they get access to society even though they're a freak. But what this does is it kind of normalizes an insane idea in the population. And this has all these residual effects. It completely undermines notions of femininity and masculinity in the culture. It exposes people to the capacity to be groomed, to be sexually assaulted. It becomes this kind of social contagion that autistic children get caught in, and they end up getting convinced that they need to like start taking weird treatments and getting weird surgeries and so forth, mutilating their bodies and undermining their development. So there are all these kind of like secondary kind of consequences that are clearly like destructive to the community that come from empathy towards an individual. So it's like, well, your individual interest as a person who wants to be just treated like anyone else isn't compatible with the communal interest. And so we can either have a community that exists to serve you as gender people, or we can have a community that exists for its communal good, which means you get negative consequences. Like we have to punish you, we have to ostracize you and delegitimize you and so forth in order for the communal good to be realized. And so when I look at like the elite agenda,
I'd rather a concept of the balance of individual and communal good, where the good of the part entails the good of the whole, and the good of the whole entails the good of the parts. Because if you have this situation where like the majority can persecute the minority because they're a threat, that's going to lead to a lot of issues.
I mean, obviously, you could also make an argument when it comes to tourism, saying, well, it's actually not to your good because you're living in kind of like direct rejection of your own inherent nature. Like you were born a man or a woman, and you're living in a kind of denial and performative rejection, and you're engaging in all these practices of self-mutilation, and you're having social incapacity to function because you're trying to assign yourself the wrong. So this is against your own natural good as well. So we should kind of help you through taking you to like therapy and so forth to kind of identify with your actual for your own good. So yeah, I can see what you're saying there. But the reason why I use that as an example is because when I look at the elite agenda, it's just very clear to me that they aren't acting in the communal good. They're acting in the interests of what suits elite bankers, what suits a particular ethnicity, which I can't name, I think, or can I just say, I don't know. They're acting in the interests of these very particular elements that are also the people that have all the power, that set the agenda, that set the narratives, that run all the academic and media institutions and so forth, and have the organized capacity to suppress and persecute anyone who disagrees with them. And it's like, I don't think these people are enlightened. I think these people are malevolent, and they're clearly pursuing the enrichment of their own power at the expense of what's in the community's interests.
Just look at this one more time, because I think Aristotle's argument that Aquinas endorses could apply here as well. The elite that you're talking about, they set up institutions like the UN, like Davos, Bilderberg Group, that are actively negotiating global relations, keeping the peace in some cases, maybe not always, maybe it is just a vehicle of empire, whatever. But like if they have a global plan, they have foresight. According to Aristotle's argument, they are the natural rulers, and the peoples of the world are the natural subordinates. And
yeah, we need to come up with an alternative. I agree with you that we need to come up with an alternative paradigm. I'm not opposed to having international bodies where we can have like treaties, where we can enshrine normative standards of international law to settle disputes, and we can like kind of develop like a diplomatic capacity to mediate disputes, and all of these things are obviously good. So there are clearly like good functions that are occurring here. I'm not saying like we need to like reject any international institution whatsoever. It's more about the specificity of what's being done with this globalist project, and the way that it basically is trying to displace. It's not trying to work with the sovereignty of nation states to bring them into harmony with one another and peace between the nations. It's actively trying to liquidate forms of sovereignty which it perceives as a threat to the personal power and enrichment of particular private interests. So it's by an Aristotelian definition, a tyranny. So like, for example, if you look at the Davos group, I don't know how far you want to get into like conspiracy theory and so forth, but like in my view, I posted about this on Telegram, the way I interpret the climate change agenda, the COVID response and so forth, is, do you know what chondriative cycles are in economics? It's like there's like this technological cycle where you get this kind of new technological wave, and you get this cycle of investment that produces economic growth and lasts like 30 to 40 years. So you had like automobiles, in like the 20s and the 30s coming online, and this produced like a whole cycle, and then you get information technology and so on. And it's like now we've kind of like exhausted information technology, because if you're an investor and you want to make serious cash, you want to invest in a company that goes from being a startup to a monopoly. And companies can't go from being a startup to a monopoly if they aren't in a new industry. Because if you're in a pre-established industry, you're simply not going to be able to outcompete all the other established actors. You might go from a startup to being a decent sized company, but you're not going to get like a maximum market share. Those markets are already being served. If you're servicing a completely new market, if you're first on the scene, you have a kind of automatic monopoly, and you can go from 0 to a million, right? And that's like all the biggest companies in the United States today and the world: Apple, Google, Facebook, Amazon. These are examples of these kinds of companies that go from 0 to monopoly. And if you put your money in those, that's how you make serious dollars. That's how, multi-billionaires get produced. That's how we get Peter Thiel's and Elon Musk's and Jeff Bezos's and Bill Gates's. That's how you produce these kinds of people, is by building these kinds of companies. So information tech has kind of produced its wave of these megacorps. And now a new wave needs to be produced. So we need a new technological field. And what I see with like green energy and the kind of anti-meat agenda and COVID vaccines and so forth, this kind of like biotech, green tech innovation space that's emerging, where all these new technological fields where there's massive amounts of state investment can go in, and you have all these like DARPA projects and so on that are facilitating, and other kind of government related projects that are facilitating this new technological wave that, the big investors can put their money in and make their serious returns, and they can kind of raise a new series of billionaires to be like a new wave of oligarchs that can throw their weight around in American and Western society for the next few decades, that are kind of built upon this new political economic power structure. That's what I see the Davos group is facilitating. I don't buy the global warming narrative. I didn't buy the COVID narrative. I think these things, or this idea that we can't eat meat anymore because we're going to destroy the planet if we keep eating steaks. I think these things are actually BS, and they're contrived issues. They're not enlightened. Like they know more than the public about how terrible these things are. I think they're contrived issues that are being kind of used as an agenda to kind of guide and plan the political economic power structure for the next few decades. So they can kind of manage who the winners are going to be, so that it's the same group that it always is, or people that are dependent upon the same group that it always is.
Right.
And if you look and if you read like a lot of stuff coming out of the World Economic Forum relating to political theory, it's like these kinds of economic theorists that like see the economy in this way. People like Mazzucato, who I've talked about a lot, who wrote The Entrepreneurial State and so forth. So anyway, sorry, you were going to say something.
Yes. These people, though, they are trying to ensure that they remain in power, just like all power structures typically do. But they do have, so far, the best track record for creating a stable world order. I mean,
I don't think it's that stable right now, but okay.
But like, okay, how does China handle the interaction of other nations in its sphere? Its position is, we're going to control your water supply, we're going to control your ports, we're going to control your infrastructure, so we have you by the balls and you stay in line. Is that the better way of going about things? That seems like you're just asking for animosities to build up, and people will view China as the tyrant, whereas the Atlanticist elite, they do have more reach than China. I think they have more capacities of social engineering than China. I think they are in the position to keep the peace better than anyone else. Again, I'm not a supporter of the regime, but like, by an argument for like it's what's best for the world, I think they can certainly justify what they're doing to themselves. I mean, who else is out there offering a better kind of global solution? I don't think anybody is. So to their mind, if having no one at the helm means chaos, geopolitical instability, war, maybe extinction, right? People use nuclear weapons or develop some dangerous new biotech weapon, new like engineered virus or bacteria or whatever, it could get out of hand really easily. So I think this is ultimately, like, regardless of contingencies, their economic motives, etc. I think the one thing the globalists have is this core argument that if they just let things go unchecked, then technological proliferation will mean human extinction at some point or another.
I think you're packaging these two things together. It's like, yeah, I agree. We need to have some kind of global leadership. You need to come up with a paradigm under which you can deal with global problems. And I think the West is obviously like the kind of main candidate for global leadership. The Chinese are emerging more and more. It still is kind of de facto global leader, but I don't think it needs to be packaged with the exact set of policies. Like, I don't think it needs to be packaged with demographic replacement, promoting gay marriage everywhere and transgender ideology, and, having this kind of cabal of investment bankers, concocting global crises to kind of structurally justify guided reforms to like the political economic structure that like maintain their kind of power, and beat down their competitors. If you look at the kind of rhetoric coming out of American politics right now, like if you saw like, the dark Brandon speech the other day that was infamous on the internet, where the kind of rhetoric that Biden is using to describe Trump supporters and so on. American politics is a mess at the moment. It's hardly a kind of paragon of stability. You're seeing the war in Ukraine, you're seeing hostilities in Taiwan, you're seeing defection of many Eurasian states to neutrality. And even some South American states are kind of taking a position of neutrality. And even a couple of Eastern European, like the Hungarians even, are taking a position of neutrality towards the American-led world order to kind of maintain good relations with the Chinese and the Russians. So what we're seeing is that like these people are not very good at leading the world because they're parasites and tyrants. They aren't trying to pursue the good. They're bad dudes. Like when the Americans won the Cold War, if they didn't have such evil people in charge, such parasitic tyrants in charge, they didn't like blow their load, waste all their energy invading Iraq, Afghanistan, if they didn't stupidly induct the Chinese into the World Trade Organization and just transfer all this industrial wealth to China, if they didn't needlessly antagonize the Russians and isolate them from the world order, they wouldn't be in this position that they are right now. They wouldn't have pissed off the Iranians and the Chinese and the Russians to such a point that they've created this second block, and they've brought in the Pakistanis and so on and these other states. This wouldn't have actually happened. It's a direct consequence of their mismanagement of the global system. And if you look at like, Europe is about to experience an energy crisis as it goes into winter. It's freezing there. Like old people are going to die because of the issues with the Russians. And what you're seeing in Europe is the rise of right-wing nationalist parties in Eastern and Southern Europe that are becoming more and more popular. It doesn't get reported about as much in the news because I think they don't want to add any more momentum to it. But like you can see polls in Italy, in Spain, Poland, and so forth showing these trends. And they had like a massive protest the other day, I think in Prague, which had like 70,000 people in the streets protesting against NATO policy and so forth. And that's only going to increase. So there's going to be mass unrest. You see mass unrest in the United States with Trump supporters versus the regime dynamic. That's a powder keg. So I just see instability everywhere. And the potential for World War III between the United States and the Chinese, they're playing a game of chicken basically over Taiwan. Who knows how much that can escalate? It's scary to think about. So this idea that they're just managing the global system really well and there's this stability and world peace and it's wonderful, I don't buy it. I don't think these people are doing a good job, man.
Well, there's a couple of possibilities. Either they've made some mistakes. Okay, let's suppose they made mistakes. We need another force to take their place. And if you want to go forward with a kind of nationalist politics, you really need to define that international order and how the whole and part stacks up all the way from that through the nation, down to the family structure, even including definitions of what is a true family structure and what's a false one, what's a true individual and what's a false one. Because I'm sure we're going to have, with transhumanist stuff, borders being stretched around the issue of individual identity. So like if the integrity of the parts is what justifies the whole in some sense, at least partly, then we need to like really have deep like metaphysical justifications of each of these layers in the hierarchy. I
agree with that. I like your demand for rigor in worldview. Like I'm 100% agree with you on that. I don't think I have like the absolute metaphysical answers to every single problem that like you could raise philosophically with like the entire world. Working on it as best I can. But I think when it comes to politics, I've kind of focused a lot more on politics, the kind of political end of the spectrum, particularly as of late. And I think that I'm right about the idea that if you want to create a global order, the way you do it is by kind of respecting that there are all of these different groups that they aren't going to want to be all squashed into this borderless global community, which is kind of run upon this kind of degenerate ideology of rights and feminism and so forth. This is not a universalizable ideology by any means. And I think it's creating hostility in the rest of the world. So I think what you need to come up with is a new paradigm that respects these different nations and their cultures to an extent, and Gibbs says, okay, we want to build a global order that has certain normative rules so that we can have peace and friendship in the world for a collective good. But you get to still retain particularities of your culture and autonomy, as much as possible. Like the principle of subsidiarity, it's like, I think is a good principle, again, from Catholic social political teaching, which is, if you can solve a problem at a lower scale, it doesn't need to be sent up the hierarchy to be solved at a higher scale. So if we can solve it in the family, we don't need to solve it at a higher level. We can solve it in the local community, it doesn't need to go higher. If we can solve it in the state, it doesn't need to go to the national government and so on. This is a good principle, I think, because it doesn't create this kind of hostility to these larger power structures where it's like this power structure is trying to destroy my family, destroy my community, destroy my ethnic group, destroy my culture. So I'm going to view them as an enemy, and I'm going to try and do everything I can to strengthen myself against them and fight back against them, which is what's happening. And it's pulling apart this global system, and it's going to produce warfare. It's going to produce destruction, all these consequences that you say this system is supposed to be preventing, because it doesn't respect subsidiarity at all. It has no respect for it. It wants to impose this centralized structure upon everything, and that's bad. It's not going to work. So from a pragmatic level and from a moral level, it's not going to work. So we can go back to the drawing board and come up with a new paradigm. And I think ethno-nationalism has a part to play in that new paradigm for sure, because it does have that element of subsidiarity that you're not going to have that same hostility. It's like, okay, you still get to kind of, like, you look at EU as a case study at this. When the EU was first created, it was like, okay, you're not going to have to give up your particular national governments, your autonomy as nation states, but we want to create a unified Europe because we don't want to have a war in Europe. We want to have collective prosperity, and we can integrate all of our economies, and we have a certain amount of free movement of people, and it's going to be great because we can kind of share all of Europe's potential amongst all the different European states and enrich the poorer states and strengthen the larger states and have collective security and a shared destiny. And it sounded great. Then you create this bureaucratic institution in Brussels, and then it just goes about systematically undermining the national sovereignty of all these different particular and national identities of all these particular states, because it wants to centralize and centralize and centralize. It wants to have an EU army. It wants to have an EU government that has more and more power over everything. And we have to kind of bring in all these immigrants into all these other countries to dilute their sense of national identity and demonize nationalist movements as Russian propaganda and all this kind of stuff, so that we can just completely destroy all these different national communities in Europe, so we can have this kind of Europe as a nation that could become a new superpower, which would be, and that's getting rejected with nationalist movements all across Europe.
We've just looked at the one hypothesis that the elites have made mistakes. The other hypothesis is that they are doing 4D chess, and there is a strategy behind the kind of instability they're generating. I think many times they've operated on a kind of problem, reaction, solution principle. So if we're seeing the rise of nationalist movements, like I, for one, believe that Germany was supported by finance considerably. And that's part of the reason why that regime rose up. And I do think they were set up to fail in some respects. So also bear in mind that the ideology that's being proposed on the part of the people who are breaking down national identities, breaking down traditional religious identities, they are transhumanist. They really do believe that technological change will fundamentally alter the character of man. And they're not necessarily far wrong there. As we see genetic engineering, more like IVF, embryo selection, we will see changes in human nature, technological augmentation, whether it's like Neuralink or something along those lines, or just augmented reality and people having access to cell phones. It is changing behaviors. It is changing the nature of the human condition. You're arguing that we should have respect for these existing forms in the face of this flux and progress and change. And like, okay, it's natural that you would feel that. I agree too, but you need like metaphysical justification for the limit, for the form. and against the change and flux. It's a deeper question than politics, but I think that's more the game that we're actually, I don't think the elites are just failing. I think a third world war, global conflict is something that they have had in the cards for a long time. And I think they will have some kind of solution up their sleeve. And things like, okay, I don't know if I should say this on my channel, but things like the disease that came out late 2019, right? Perhaps people had already discussed what to do about this sort of situation, and perhaps certain things were a kind of test at a large scale. And I think there's a long history of them doing this problem, reaction, solution. So if we see increasing global instability, it's very possible that what they want is for the people of the world to cry out for some kind of savior figure, some kind of way of getting out of the current crisis. Just like everyone was willing to submit to the government, totally be prohibited from going to church because of that disease. I think if things get bad enough, if Europe doesn't have energy, that puts them in a much more powerful position to then come in and offer the solutions and be viewed as the savior. And I think that people are in general kind of dumb enough to fall for it. So it might be very well within their plans, what's going on at the moment. I don't know that, but
my view, I think you give these people too much credit, and I don't think there's sufficient cause. Like, my view of what's happening with Europe is the Americans want to strengthen their grip on Europe because they know that China is their big enemy, and they can't afford to use carrots to keep Europe on their side and not have enough resources left over to use sticks to hold back the Chinese. So basically forcing the Europeans into a state of dependence so that they are a more reliable kind of check on the Russians, so that they can have a bit of a stalemate, I think, in Europe, rather than this kind of dynamic situation where the Germans and the Russians are getting along and the kind of geopolitics. Like, the whole point of the EU has always been keep the Germans down and the Russians out, so to speak, like without technical complexity. But that's the kind of basic Atlanticist game plan, right? And that's what's basically being done. You kind of like strengthen the bloc against the Russians, but also impoverish them so they can't really, so they're totally dependent upon you. And then you can kind of like pivot your foreign policy to Chinese containment. So I think like geopolitics kind of explains these dynamics. I think if there was this kind of global elite that were kind of controlling everything behind the scenes and they had like perfect agency and everything was according to their plan, I don't think the global system is that easy to control. I think it's a really complex system, and there's so many different elements that are run by people with egos, and they have their own agendas. Like, I don't think the Russians and the Chinese are controlled by this like global cabal. I think like they have their own agency, and they have their own agenda. Yeah, they, like, particularly the Chinese are kind of, they have to kind of work with the international system, but just because they're kind of working with it doesn't mean that they don't have their own interests. And even within like the West, I think there are kind of disparate interests within the elite as well, although they obviously is a lot of homogeneity in their strategy. So I see like the West as being controlled by this group that you're describing, but I just don't see it as being globally powerful. And when it comes to the Germans in the lead up to the Second World War, I also see the Germans as rogues. I don't see them as being kind of controlled by these interests either. Yes, like they did get loans from certain elite bankers and so forth, but I kind of see that as just, well, hedging. You know, like you don't know which side is going to win, so you know you got to build relationships with both sides because the world order is could be defined by either side. So you need to have good relations. If you kind of go all in on one side and they lose, then you're screwed, right? That's a far more parsimonious explanation than like there's this like elite banking cartel that just have this kind of insane amount of agency that are just able to orchestrate world events like it's like a stage play. I think warfare is too complicated to predict. It's not.
Because the global situation is so complicated, that's why they use this kind of problem reaction solution, because all of the problems that people are dealing with, they have salience detection about a given problem. So whether it's your national identity or whether it's access to particular natural resources, whatever it is, like people are concerned about some most salient threat in their environment, and their political activity is kind of geared towards that salient threat. What the elites have been able to do many times is get everyone to think that this artificially generated threat, like a particular disease perhaps, is like the main one, and then everyone naturally kind of politically aligns with their strategy because they believe in this threat being raised. So I do have a greater estimation, but I also acknowledge that I don't fundamentally know the nature of the international elite and whether they do have this kind of long run agenda and whether they are allowing certain things to degenerate into chaos. But when I look at like moves like they know the consequences in supporting the war and prolonging the war in Ukraine. They know what that will do to European energy. Joe Biden knew what it would do to U.S. energy to shut down the Keystone Pipeline and other pipelines as well. So they would have to be complete idiots not to foresee the instability that they're bringing about, which is why I tend to think, okay, they're not complete idiots. They do have some problem reaction solution type scenario planned. But I think the more relevant point here is that the global elite, the core faction of them, I think, understands that human nature is going to change. We will see human genetic engineering, human modifications of various sorts within the next couple decades. And if they don't condition people to accept that kind of breakdown of individual human identity, then they won't have the edge over somewhere like China, where maybe the Chinese regime has control over its people to the effect that they do hand over the nature of their reproduction to artificial systems, for example, Brave New World style stuff. So I think they are arguing technologically that this sort of transition to a post-humanity is inevitable. And that's why like breaking down these traditional structures is in their interest. And so I do think it's part of like a mass social engineering plan that's all kind of geared towards maintaining global hegemony against any potential rival. And that they argue for that on the basis that you need global peace to avoid human extinction. The fault point in their argument is that we can have some good for a post-humanity, that abandoning the human condition is a good. You need to tie national identity to the human condition, the family structure to the human condition, orient those in a hierarchy, and justify them in a metaphysically fundamental way. And then you need to tie that into an alternative global system that could be implemented very quickly. The times we're living in are obviously time sensitive. Like technology is changing very fast. Resource availability is changing very fast. So it's like a lot that nationalists would have to do very quickly. So how do you address that issue that they think that a post-human condition will be more adaptive? I hear this on Joe Rogan all the time. He's constantly saying, like, if I was a Australopithecus, I wouldn't want to have fire and live in a house. I would want to live in the trees. But, you know, things change. He's constantly making arguments for transhumanism. He's the largest podcast in the Western world. So I think he's an indicator of where people's heads are at. So I don't know. How do you respond to that? That's what you would have to respond to, I think.
Well, I guess like it depends what you mean by transhumanism, because, you know, I'm kind of skeptical of its capacity in many ways. Like, I think basically where it would be interesting would be gene editing, and there are definitely ethical issues with gene editing. I think the optimal ethical solution would be like to try and suppress the technology as basically being immoral. If it's something inevitable that is going to kind of emerge, and you start seeing like a kind of like eugenics applications to build like, I don't know, super soldiers and like super smart, like, you know, technologists and so forth. I don't really see why that would undermine nationalism or something. It would just be like, oh wow, like now we have smarter engineers and stronger soldiers. I don't really see why that really like changes anything kind of comprehensively.
These people think of the mind in terms of information systems and signal propagations, and they're already mainstream cognitive scientists are arguing for collective cognition being a real thing. Like you can say that groups of people constitute a mind of sorts. And so when we have things like Neuralink that increase the bandwidth with which people communicate, and many more people are tied into these sorts of augmented reality setups, or just some way in which information flows are controlled more tightly and expanded in terms of velocity, like that will lead to collective identities that are completely artificial, that will be much more powerful than instinctual ethnic affinities and things of that nature.
Yeah, well, I guess like, so like I've had the personal experience of going on the internet and then becoming more traditionalist and more nationalist and more racially conscious and so forth than I would otherwise have been if it wasn't for the internet. So communication, I think in many ways will probably enhance elements of traditionalism and nationalism, because these more complex notions of human identity require elaborate processes of initiation, that like active communities that can be kind of constituted through, like, if you think, for example, the TV generation, where like if you wanted to kind of access to politics, it's like you kind of get your political information, you kind of maybe you read the New York Times or like your newspaper, with your morning breakfast, and then you watch the nightly news. And so like the amount of, and maybe you hear like some talk radio or something. So the amount of like politics and the amount of like options you have for like what kind of content you can consume is very limited. And the amount of time you focus on it through the day is a lot less. Whereas now you can go on Twitter and follow anyone you want, any kind of like niche ideological take that you want, and you can basically have like unlimited access, and you can participate. There's comment sections, there's all this kind of user participation. So the kind of passive nature of like watching Fox News or something is completely transformed, where people develop these really elaborate, highly worked out identities that are based on like this kind of direct participation and community building. As you know, so I think all what you're describing is only going to enhance that. I don't see how that really kind of works for having some kind of like global homogenous ideology. I think what you're going to get is more intense subcultural kind of
Yes,
identities forming.
that's what the elites will do, right? They have always been interested in cults. Military intelligence, CIA, has been caught helping cult leaders, like that happened with Charles Manson, right? They gave him the LSD and taught him how to brainwash people using it. Having a bunch of really tightly integrated cults and having a science of how these cults emerge puts them very firmly in control, even if the cults are radically polarized and can't see eye to eye at all. What that effectively does is you can't have like a mass movement of authentic good ideology. Like if you believe that Newtonian physics was just an inherently good idea, was more accurate than what came before, that spread through the population because people could listen to reason. But now a scientific theory, even everyone in their own particular camp can look for the scientific data that's been published that reinforces their own biases, right? So you have this kind of breakdown of a common epistemological framework. You have the emergence of a bunch of different cults that are all structured and formed on the basis of communication technologies. Like the way that you got involved in right-wing politics was conditioned by the YouTube algorithm, all these sorts of things. So I think having
But
a bunch
also,
of cults actually helps them who are controlling.
no, I agree. I think that's like one of the main, obviously they kind of control a lot of the design. I think one of the main vectors of competition will be trying to compete in terms of basically how social media is designed. Because I remember when I first kind of got initiated into, let's say, what is now known as the dissident right, which was 2014, 2015, around then, there wasn't anywhere near the same amount of censorship that there is now. So it was really easy for dissidents to basically access the same audience as everybody else. And on like Facebook and YouTube and so on, you could access anything and everything freely. And what you had was a kind of mass radicalization event that I think corresponded with Trump's election and Brexit and so forth, for kind of like shift in political consciousness where the right took on this kind of new cultural meaning.
That was itself engineered, in my opinion. But
I don't know if it was necessarily, I mean, maybe like Trump was engineered, yeah, or like Brexit might have been engineered. But when it comes to what went along with that, like the kind of subcultural milieu, I think that was organic in many ways.
No, 4chan is a fed op and probably always was. But that's an empirical claim. I don't know for sure that it's true, but I'm suspicious.
Well, yeah, okay, but there's like all of these people that engage with that subculture in an organic way, and content creators and so forth that developed followings. I don't think all of them are feds. Like,
No.
I have pretty extensive knowledge.
Instinctually, but the platforms are designed in a certain way and you're predictable. The fact that people organically interact with these subcultures just means they're predictable because our instincts are predictable. So
but what I'm saying is I think there were these elements in our culture that were suppressed by the previous media form, and early social media enabled them to get on a level playing field with the mainstream cultural ideas on a level playing field, they were winning. They were taking massive victories, I think, due to the inherent virtue of the ideas. And only through mass censorship could that kind of be blocked. So what I'm saying is, yeah, like if mass censorship can continue, if they keep controlling these technologies to the extent that they have, then yeah, it is a black pill. But if there is a way in which we can kind of fight back, and kind of as technologies keep developing, as you get a phase shift, maybe new opportunities open up. It's hard to kind of speculate on technologies that haven't been invented yet, obviously. But as things develop, I could see it going the other way, where I think traditional Christianity and traditional white people who aren't like mind fucked think about politics is kind of like what I think. And I think traditional Christianity, particularly traditional Catholicism, is the most defensible religious faith. And like classical metaphysics, it's still unrivaled. So I think the kind of essence of the Western tradition, it will always assert itself and win if it can get on a level playing field. And it only loses due to like artificial manipulation. So I think I do think we have like inherent virtue on our side. So like, yeah, a mass proliferation of cults and so on and so forth. But I think what we have that those cults don't have is the truth. So
only metaphysical truth gives the traditional worldview an advantage, but the ability to like arbitrarily concoct new forms of social engineering is enhancing as time goes on. And so they're viewing human nature as malleable while we want to view human nature as fixed. The problem is that like our communities aren't, and maybe in the last few months they are, but they aren't like progressing in their comprehension and understanding of classical metaphysics as fast as like the other side is moving towards transhumanism. Like we're not making progress with the perennial philosophy. It's just still sitting there. But in any case, like I think a nationalism that would be meaningful would have to, on the one hand, metaphysically justify the nature of the group, the existence of the group. Like, is there a collective good? How is it defined? And they have to be really tightly integrated. I mean, ultimately, you can try this in a kind of accommodating nationalist framework where you don't have to be Catholic. You can be all sorts of different worldviews and defend this one common nationalist presupposition. I don't think that works. The only way that that would work is if it was tied into a deeply traditionalist or perennialist metaphysical picture in which Muslims, Hindus, Buddhists, Christians can all agree, because there is common ground there. But like you can't have it where you incorporate secular thinking as well. You can't have a ground of legitimacy or a concept of the common good as long as that diversity exists at
if you don't have God, then it's hard to have natural law, obviously. So
yes.
Yeah,
right. So
so I agree with that. I think maybe though, even though obviously as a Catholic, I have strong views on a personal level, on a political level, in a society which is only 20% Catholic or something, I would say, well, okay, but you have a bunch of Protestants or something. It's like, okay, well, I think we have enough common ground in our shared Christianity to try and, like, from a pragmatic stance, like, work towards the good politically without having to be like everyone has to be a Catholic, otherwise like we can't be political friends. Like I think there is, in a global context, even with other faiths, like probably work out good relations. And that's kind of why you need subsidiarity. That's why you probably need localism, because it's like, well, if you try to put a bunch of Muslims and Christians in the same country, that probably ain't going to work. But maybe if you can have a Muslim country and a Christian country being friends, it's more likely to work because they still have their own communities where they don't feel as threatened by one another.
That principle of subsidiarity and this principle of like preserving national differences, that has to be justified within some kind of ethical framework. And that can't just exist free floating. It needs to be grounded in a metaphysics.
I agree with you. I mean, I do think
I'm saying like different religions, different metaphysics. So how do you get around that?
Well, I mean, aren't you a perennialist? I know Keith talks about perennialism a lot. He seems to view, well, there is kind of classical theism. There are certain kind of substrates of Hinduism and Buddhism and so forth that could be kind of reconciled with it to a certain level. I feel less optimistic about that than he and I guess you do. But when dealing within a a Western context at the very least, which seems to be the real locus of the problem. It's like, well, we kind of have obviously it's fading, but we still have a certain amount of assumed Christianity. We were in like this post-Christian framework, and the kind of other religions are only really prominent with these like, non-white immigrant communities. They're not really, and even a lot of them are actually converting to Christianity, or the ones who have converted to Christianity are kind of seemingly more desiring to move to the West or whatever. I don't know exactly. Like, in the American context, it doesn't seem like Christianity from a religious perspective is really the only game in town.
I'm not talking about like political action, though. I'm talking about how do you form the ideology that performs the things that I'm talking about. On the one hand, you need to justify the common good and the naturalness of certain types of human groups, from the family on up through the hierarchy. That's on the one hand. On the other hand, how do you solve the global stability problem, including the threats from technology and all of those arguments? And like, I don't think you can answer both of those questions with a loose, like, well, oh, we're all Christians.
No, of course not. No, but when I talk about ethno-nationalism, that's why Keith and I have been focused on sociology of nationalism and so forth, trying to develop a more rigorous interdisciplinary kind of analysis of what is ethnicity historically, like, and trying to kind of develop a kind of a more comprehensive theory of ethnogenesis that can kind of guide this understanding, because we are just confused about what a family is, whereas like ethnicity is obviously a lot more kind of problematized and common understanding these days. So yeah, that's obviously an important part of the project, to kind of demonstrate the organic basis for ethnicity, and also like sociological analysis of notions like social capital, where like ethnically homogenous communities, they're higher trust, people are more likely to contribute to local charities, and people report better mental health. And there's all these different kind of elements of demonstrating like greater social capital that kind of exists within them, and what that facilitates. So you can kind of like demonstrate all of these kinds of good ends that kind of come from ethnic homogeneity within a community. And also you can also talk about the inverse. You can talk about ethnic conflict, and there's myriad examples of ethnic conflict and how ethnic conflict produces bad social ends. So you can kind of combine that together quite well. And also obviously family values are pretty important in all of this as well. I think it's kind of quite obvious to people of the traditional mindset, those kinds of arguments. I'd have to really rehash, like, why the traditional family structure is good. You can go down that path if you want. And then you say, okay, well, then what kind of political community like defends these things and regulates and facilitates these things? You can fit all the pieces together quite naturally, I think, in that respect. International relations a little bit more complicated, but also we do have traditions that we can kind of draw upon. Particularly, I think we can draw upon the kind of norms that developed in late Christendom to kind of mediate international relations, which I think there's a lot of like, the work of like Bodin and these kinds of theorists. Now, I don't have like a kind of conclusive paradigm for all of this stuff, but I think I'm moving in the right areas. If you want to we could get into a discussion more fundamentally of just like ethics, if you want, as opposed to, because like politics is like applied ethics. And we've talked about politics a lot. Maybe we could just talk about ethics just on its own for a bit, to kind of end the conversation.
The point I was going to make. There's two ways of solving this problem of like the one and the many, all the way from the global scale down to the individual. You can say out of many one, or out of one many. So having a consensus-based enforcement of traditional norms, traditional political groupings, and legitimating them, to me, that's very loose and weak. Out of many, one presumes too much, I think, of the way in which we reach consensus. That's never enduring. And I don't think metaphysically that's how things work. Like generation is from one to many, not out of many, one. So you're trying to generate a new nationalism, generate a new political theory that solves many of these problems, respect the sacredness of the human individual, family, clan, all the way up. It's going to be a lot of intellectual work. And I think from one tightly integrated, holistic worldview, you can then branch, right? And that's been my approach. On the side of progress and transhumanism, they have a lot of scientific data to draw on a lot of scientific institutions seem to back a conception of human nature that's compatible with their political agenda. And so they have a huge degree of legitimacy, and they can kind of manufacture consensus because they control these scientific institutions. I think anything less than that, scientific consensus, will not succeed in competing against the global transhumanists.
Yeah, that's for sure.
Yeah. So instead, you integrate metaphysics through ethics, through politics, form a single group that works together and then branches and proliferates and creates the diversity in that way. And that can map, for example, take a bunch of the people in all of these spaces who are working through these issues, get them all together in a common place, hammer out the differences, and get to worldview level consensus. I do think that's possible with a limited group of high IQ people, and then send those people back where they came from potentially and map that worldview into all of the original, kind of get the synthesis of like where they came from and that new vision. I think that would work. That's a many out of one strategy rather than a one out of many strategy.
That's why, like I said at the beginning, obviously this would make sense being that I'm a Catholic, but that's why it would need to be a universalist, quote unquote, one struggle conception where you would be trying to create a paradigm that could work for all peoples in the world, like where you would say, okay, here's like a basic normative understanding that could be a paradigm for world politics to operate within. And obviously then there would be like certain kind of leeway within that structure for each particular national group. And then you said one of the main problems you have with the theory is like, okay, so how do you know, you say you have an ethnic separatist group, how do you know whether to back them or not to back them as an international community? And that is an interesting problem, right? And I don't think it really has a straightforward answer, because I think it would really depend upon what are they separating from. Is the group that they're separating from trying to accommodate them, trying to grant reasonable autonomy or not, or are they being actively oppressed? Like, do they have like a legitimate claim that the political structure that they're embedded within is abusing them in some kind of fundamental sense, and so they need to have their own kind of political institutions, like for their own sake, and so you'd have to kind of work it out along those lines and apply it by a case basis. I think working within this kind of paradigm of discourse is something that is going to be a lot easier to build allies like globally upon, because you're trying to create a kind of universal moral structure that actually respects them, where the current order is saying you need to be more like what the US State Department thinks you should be like. And the reason why you should be like that is because we're going to fund a bunch of NGOs and think tanks. They're going to go into your country and subvert all your institutions, and we're going to kind of corrupt your political leadership and so on. And we're going to kind of impose this alien ideology on you. It's like we're offering genuine friendship. What the alternative is this kind of messed up empire, this kind of tyrannical empire. So I think we're selling something like that's a lot more agreeable than the alternative. So the question is just how to kind of build it into the level of sophistication required that you can even put it on the table. And right now it isn't really on the table because the institutional basis for marketing it as a sophisticated end product just isn't there yet. So I guess that's the project or engagement, is trying to get it to that level so that it can
I don't think ethics can be free floating. They have to be tied into a metaphysics. And at that level, like, you're looking for the one true philosophy to ground this thing. That's my opinion. And then out of that philosophical consensus, you can build communities, you can build.
So for example, when it comes to ethics, like what would be your like quick take, your ethical views and like the basic kind of metaphysical moves that kind of ground that?
Right. Well, I mean, we are a combination of form and matter, and where we are defective, where we are imperfect, is where we fail to map onto the forms that actually give structure to us. So moving towards that formal, I'm a Platonist, obviously. So as you move towards that formal reality, you move towards the good, because the good is the form of forms. So the end of the individual life is philosophical contemplation of those forms, because that's the active part that we can take in assimilating ourselves to those universal archetypes. And then of society, I think the traditionalist conception is the same. Society exists to shepherd souls towards this kind of realization of that which gives them structure and being. So like, that's why traditional societies have generally moved from like a priest caste that's relatively ascetic, that like actually consummates the goal of society to return to the intelligible, return to God. And then there are various castes that enforce that. It's kind of like a funnel, a vortex kind of system where the people at the bottom of the hierarchy are putting in their time and like perfecting themselves to gradually move up and up, not in like a capitalist sense, upward social mobility, but upward closer to a kind of life where they could then consummate the good itself, which is to be found in the soul. But to find it in the soul, it requires a certain kind of philosophical method. And so then that core philosophy structures religious practice, structures everything else. That's the kind of long and short of ethics for me.
Yeah, I don't really find anything disagreeable with what you said. That was kind of what I was trying to start driving towards but I was kind of like building it from a kind of like existential criticism of reductive hedonism, utilitarianism, or whatever, by saying, well, my identity transcends identifying with these passions of the flesh, but is bound up in these kind of complex relations. And obviously the most fundamental relation is relation to being as such, which then requires me to kind of contemplate upon, well, what is the ground of being? And then I can't really find a satisfactory answer for that outside of God, and therefore how can I relate to God? And then I would basically subscribe to kind of relatively conventional Thomist take upon, well, there is natural law, God created nature with purpose. As you said, like matter has to kind of be brought into a realization of form in the sense of, well, at the beginning of time, or in God's mind, all of existence would have to exist as potential. And so like the potential for all things would be bound up within like divine purpose, which would be the good of those things. So in kind of like trying to articulate the kind of universal, which is the potential in the mind of God that could be actualized in all things over which we have responsibility and agency, we're kind of like seeking out the will of God. And therefore we are kind of, from an existential standpoint, trying to kind of come to terms with being as such, like why we have existence and what our kind of structure of obligations are to play. Because when I kind of self-examine the fact that I have will has this kind of complex self-relation that's obviously mediated by the reason, in the sense of I kind of ask, well, what is the purpose of my will? So like rather than just kind of adopting the passions of the flesh and saying, well, I will this, so I'll do it, I say, well, wait a second, I'm not sure if I actually want to do what my passion's implying in this particular scenario, because I've done that before and bad things happened. And so I'm kind of going to kind of like rationally go, okay, well, what is the purpose of my will? Where does it come from? And how can I kind of use it in order to kind of like realize that purpose? And so that kind of like requires me to go through that kind of elaborate series of speculations that comports me to religion and natural law. And so that would be, where like fundamentally I'd be deriving my ethics and teleology, like kind of like a kind of theological analysis. I mean, I think I wouldn't really think that you and I would really disagree on ethical questions that much. Previously, I was caught in these traps. Like I was caught in traps, like in my thinking, like over the years of knowing you, like I was caught in traps of like linguistic relativism, where I would like confuse, and you correctly identified it as like a form of nominalism, where I would kind of confuse the nomination of things for like the idea of things. It's like, well, how do I know how to nominate things if they aren't what I'm nominating them as? Well, I don't. Insofar as like my language is actually attaching to a thing, there must be some thingness which prefigures that kind of connection of language to it. So I think once you accept universals and you accept divinity and you kind of think through it enough, I think you can actually come to moral consensus quite easily. And I think even like the kind of, I mean, how do you really perceive the kind of Aristotle-Plato divide on this? Because obviously there are kind of distinct. Yeah, I know you like Plato, but I'm saying like, how do you kind of see the implications of Aristotelian ethics? Like, where does Aristotelian ethics go wrong? Because I can understand why you side with Plato metaphysically, but how does it really cash out to issues with Aristotle's metaphysics?
Well,
Aristotle's ethics. Sorry.
Aristotle's metaphysics is just an adumbrated version of Plato's metaphysics. Aristotle stops at what Plato would call the demiurge, and Plato goes beyond that. And similarly with his ethics, he goes up to effectively the civic virtues and a bit of the contemplative virtues, like the philosophical life is the best of all lives for both of them. But what you are doing with that philosophical life, for Plato, you actually do move beyond human life, bodily life, and get access to the eternal side of your own being. And then through identifying with that eternal nature, when death comes, like there is a continuate for Aristotle, there's no continuation. So that really
Oh no, I thought.
makes
Well, doesn't Aristotle say that the intellect is like
but we all do the same intellect for Aristotle. So it's like, in a way, you have immortality in a very vague sense, but like he doesn't believe in reincarnation and stuff like that. Like personal immortality after death is real for Plato, not real for Aristotle. And I think as a result of that, like the practical virtues that we can embody for Aristotle, the kinds of actions that it's worthwhile to perform for Aristotle, all ties into like what we can achieve in a particular lifetime. Like his definition of happiness is unimpeded activity of our proper virtues. And I think those virtues are just kind of limited to a single lifetime where you are in society in this particular life. And it just kind of doesn't view the holistic context. I think the kind of contemplation, I don't really know. I'm trying to remember. It's been a long time since I read like the Nicomachean Ethics. I don't remember if the philosophical contemplation kind of remains at the level of form as given in sensation as he typically addresses things, like in the categories, in his theory of semantics. Like everything is bottom up for Aristotle, and that's how we know these forms. For Plato, there's like a separate faculty that we can move into to engage in this contemplation. I really don't know if Aristotle views things in the same way.
Yeah,
Also,
I mean,
Plato, like theurgy, right, and like ways of contacting higher beings. Aristotle is just a little bit more worldly in that. It doesn't look like beyond the human condition and how to transcend it.
Yeah, I guess like because when I think of versatilianism, I'm always like thinking about it through the lens of Catholic theology, which obviously kind of adds all those elements back in. But yeah, I guess that makes sense.
Okay,
But like,
I mean, basically, I'm gonna have to go pretty soon. I would just say the only way I see of this like integrated framework being developed is concrete research institutions. I mean, that's what the enemy has. They have a bunch of them, and a bunch
no, I agree with that.
educated. So until those sorts of institutions exist, it's just like you're stuck in first gear, and it's you've got a long way to go.
Well, that's what I want to build, but it's like I've been trying to get like a competent vanguard together, and then we can create some more sophisticated products, and then try and scale that up to the point where we can put together something akin to like a think tank where people can have paid staff researching, and we have like a coordinated research effort, and like
I think
put out
personally
material.
the understanding of the classics is so low and everything else is built on them, then the most productive thing we can do right now is just literally read Plato and Aristotle. And when we can get to the point where we're actually having debates of like Scotism versus Thomism, I'd say then we've made progress, but I don't see really high level debates in there yet. So
yeah, well, that's the direction that I want to move in. Like, I encouraged Keith. I said, look, we should do a reading group on Aristotle's politics, like because pretty much all of the political philosophy in the modern tradition is like in relation to that. So we should be like just like spending time doing a deep dive and just like critically going over it. And like Plato's Republic and Plato's Laws, like these are like obviously obvious texts. We should.
He's responding to the laws and the Republic in the politics, so it's even hard to understand the politics without having read Plato first. But I mean,
yeah, I think Keith has read the Republic. I read the Republic a while back, but yeah, like it naturally we'll kind of be engaging there. I also want to kind of do a deep dive into Hegel. Not that I want to like take Hegel's system, but I just think that there's a lot there that just kind of critically going through it is going to be a productive exercise, like the philosophy of right in particular when it comes to political philosophy. And yeah, like obviously like the scholastics, you have to respect them. Leibniz also really interests me. He's ridiculously prolific, so that's a big project. Yeah.
I think assimilating the Western canon, really mastering it, is a precondition here. The thing about the whole nationalist side of it is like if you go in with this bias that this is the reason for it, it might end up, well, obviously biasing your thinking about the tradition, and you should kind of suspend judgment when you're engaged in this philosophical type
Yeah, but
discourse.
I think my intuition, like I don't need a philosophical justification to know that my family is important. You know what I mean? It's like I'm pretty sure my intuition there is valid. So my nation is in crisis, and I want to deal with that
But
crisis.
what if Jesus walks up to you and says, "Unless you hate your father and mother, you can't be my disciple"?
Well,
You
obviously, I
know, it's
pray at mass like every Sunday. You know, Father, separate my cause from the nation, which is unjust, and so on. I understand that ultimately our nations are undergoing judgment because of the turning away from God and the immorality. But I still have a duty that is binding, that's important to me.
I mean,
And
for me, it doesn't precede philosophy. Like I was, maybe that's just a temperamental difference. Like I was a moral nihilist for years, and I did really messed up stuff that I would not have done if I wasn't. But I was a moral nihilist, so I went to the logical conclusion of my system, and that didn't turn out good for me. But it was because my system was wrong. And then once like I followed philosophy far enough, again, the ethical conclusions kind of wrapped back around to a lot of intuitive ideas. But it's fine if you have those. Most people do have those intuitive feelings about ethics. They consider those like valid,
well, I don't just have
you know,
I feel like
to
I
look at.
do have arguments. I do have like this substance in my view. That I don't have like this unsophisticated, just like vague intuition.
Right.
So, like
When you're
but like
reading an argument, like when you're reading Plato's recommendations in the Republic, I think it's a lot of people have reacted to it at a gut level, and to really get through the tradition and like resynthesize it and come up with a good package, it's going to require a little bit of distancing ourselves from those immediate gut reactions. And I think that's like in online circles just too prevalent. People are too quick to like snipe and get angry about things in the comments and on Twitter.
I mean, there's a lot of bad guys. There's a myriad of responsibilities, and I don't know if I don't always get the mixture right. But it's like I've got to kind of rhetorically engage people that I think are spreading bad ideas and try and counter that to a certain extent, because it's like there's a whole bunch of people that are within this scene, and I want to influence them in the right direction and check people who are influencing them in the wrong direction, because I see potential. Because there's like this dissonant right scene, there's this kind of space of people that are kind of outside of the mainstream consciousness, that fertile ground, a lot of very intelligent people, fertile ground for finding incredible human capital. I don't like using that phrase, but you know what I mean, like finding really good people who their heart's in the right
That's
place, they're capable,
it.
and trying to extract the quality and organize them and get everybody within that circle to keep rhetorically developing, dialectically developing, so that the good ideas win out and everyone gets on the same page, and we leverage that to build institutions and sophisticate what we're doing.
Yeah.
And a part of that process is kind of jettisoning the bad people who were previously influential and kicking them out. But like, I spend a lot of time kind of engaging socially, and it does detract a little bit from getting as much pure research done. But the way that I take it is like, well, I need to engage socially to an extent, otherwise I can have all this incredible research and no one's going to be there listening to me. But if I'm kind of simultaneously engaging socially and bringing people together and doing the research all in one, then it's like that I'm building like momentum, so that like ultimately the research can actually go somewhere socially rather than just in my own head.
Yeah,
But
I
it's
mean, you could argue a lot of things against your public persona over the years, but I don't think you could argue that you haven't gained momentum. So we have to give you that. We're broadly in agreement as to a possible path forward. Again, I wouldn't, because I suspend judgment and I haven't heard a knockdown argument for it yet. I don't call myself a nationalist. I don't see it as helpful. But I mean, we agree with what needs to be done. You need a coherent, holistic worldview. You need virtuous men living in community and getting there, and then spreading that to the rest of the world somehow. And yeah, so I wish you luck in whatever form that takes for you. I mean, I put the institution kind of first. People want to defer changes of lifestyle. And really, actually, the tyranny of the elite as it exists is that they make life very comfortable for us. In fact, like, things are very cozy for a lot of people who spend all day on Twitter or whatever. We haven't felt the hardship. We don't feel the urgency of like actually moving somewhere, changing what we're doing, engaging in serious research with others. I think that's what it would take. And I think one day we'll get there. I'm just waiting for, to be honest, if we're going to be honest about this, I'm just waiting for everyone else to catch up with what I've known needs to be done for a long time. Got to build that school, but I'm glad
well,
you're.
but it's difficult though if you're American, all the Americans can like move into one place, but if you're not American, it's not so straightforward.
A school where you visit for like a month, 2 months, that would still be huge. I mean, imagine if a lot of the people in these spheres, like 30 of the brightest guys, got together for a month and just, hashed it out for a month. That would do more than a whole year.
It was definitely good, like
Just-
basically living in the same house as Keith for like 6 weeks. That was, I think, beneficial.
You got to scale that up, I think, and you'll get more results out of it. But that's just my suggestion. Anyway, I do have to go. So it was good talking with you, Joel. Again, I wish you luck. If anybody has some constructive criticism for either of us, leave it in the comments. If somebody thinks I'm not being fair to the nationalist position, what is this intellectual foundation that already exists? Maybe we're just missing it, throw a link. And I'm not trying to be like against this position a priori. I just see problems with it, and I think not enough people give it the kind of subtlety it needs, and they treat it too instinctually. But Joel, you're not doing that, so I do appreciate that.
Yeah, well, I mean, I didn't come into this conversation with an agenda or anything. I just like showed up and just had like a normal conversation. So I feel like maybe the format where people get very defensive, where it's like, oh, I've got to like defend this position because like the white race is relying on me to win this argument or whatever. Obviously, you kind of need that when you're debating someone who's actively hostile, but I don't really see you as being actively hostile. So I thought we had a good conversation because of the way that we were engaging. So I think that's productive. You could probably keep doing this kind of thing. Not just me and you, but you know what I'm saying? Because yeah, like I've had this experience as well of arguing with people that I collaborate with in private discussions, about issues like moral realism, and like banging my head against the wall. where like there's a whole bunch of people in the nationalist movement who they're like, if you accept moral realism or universals, metaphysical universals, and then you're a libtard or something. Like that's really bad. So I mean, at least I think you're on the right side on that. So just keep banging the kind of, I agree with you that you're going to keep banging the drum of like, you need to have a solid metaphysical foundation. You need to have a solid rational ethics. And if you try to take shortcuts and you try to go, well, we're going to be nihilists and postmodernists, but we're just racist, so we're going to build our national identity around that. Like that's never going to go anywhere. So I agree with that critique of like, there's people out there that are like that. So I don't think it applies to me or what I'm doing or what Keith is trying to do, but I think it does apply to a lot of people. And it's going to be a lot of rhetorical battles are going to need to take place to kind of defeat that tendency and win those people over if this is going to go anywhere. So.
But the position of like metaphysical realism, ethical realism, and classical philosophy is winning. It is gaining ground. So again, I encourage everyone also subscribe to Keith Woods on Gumroads or Subscribestar and join the Aristotle's politics discussion, because it's going to be a big one. I think an important one. So I'm looking forward to that.
Yeah. Are you going to join in too?
Yeah.
Oh yeah, sweet. Mm-hmm. That should be fun.
All right. So thanks everybody for listening. Take care. Talk to you soon.